This is the last installation of this painting. Today I'm working on foreground. And the first step with that foreground chunk of land is to get that underneath color blocked in over the warm color of the sienna brown. Some of the sienna brown is going to show through, and that's what I want, because it's going to give that light layer a warmth. Now on top of that, you can see that I'm working with 3 different colors that are roughly the same value. Remember that value is more important than color, because the value is what's going to make the big shapes of your composition stand out. You have your value balance right, it doesn't really matter if your color balance is a little bit off. And it can be devilishly tricky to match exactly the colors that you see if that's what you're trying to do. And that's a great exercise. It's going to really teach you how to color mix to do that. But if you are at a point where you're trying to get a color and it's not quite right, just make sure your value is right. And you can always experiment more with color as you go. It's a really big learning curve. What I used for most of the foreground was a filbert. I bounce back and forth between, I have a 2, a 4, and a 6 filbert. But right there, I'm actually using a different kind of brush with much shorter bristles, a little flat brush for blending. Back to the filbert. I'm just trying to get that sandy kind of look in. Now before I wanted to tackle the grasses, I had to make sure that the color of the water, the value and color of the water was right. So working quickly, not quite this quickly, but working quickly, blocked in a white and then went in with just the cerulean right out of the tube. I didn't want to mess with the blue mixing. And the color in the water is a little more vivid than the sky color anyway. A little bit more saturated close up. That also reflects what the sky is doing, because the sky is lighter down next to the mountains. So as it reflects into the water, you're going to get more saturation close to you because it's reflecting what's higher up. And that part of the water is closer to the viewer, so you want more saturation there anyway, just for a little bit of depth. There's not a whole lot of variation in the photograph, as you can see. And I didn't want to fuss with those little tiny, tiny, tiny waves glinting off the water. That was a little more than I wanted to tackle. Again, within the foreground, I want to work background to foreground, or more specifically, what's underneath working up to what's on top. You don't want to leave little chunks of stuff to do later that's showing through things like grasses or leaves. You want to make sure that you build it up so that you don't have to worry about that stuff. Sorry about the hand in front of the brush. I still have to work more on shooting so that you can actually see what I'm doing. But brush direction is really important here to capture something like grasses. Texture, color, direction, all that stuff comes together to capture what's actually happening. I wasn't looking at every strand of grass, every clump of grass. I moved them around as I wanted to fill up my foreground space, just to compose a little bit more deliberately with those chunks. And I'm using 2 darker colors. I don't know if you can make that out, but there's a brown and a green in there that are combining to make that. I think it's visible. That green, they're both very, very dark. The value is really dark, and that green sits in the middle. And once that dries, which of course doesn't take very long, that's when I get to do the really fun stuff, which is the sort of those golden brown grasses. And the shadow that sits behind it, I think that works pretty well. I had to keep on going back to adjust it. But you want to get all of that stuff done before you work on top of it. Right? Balance out everything that's going to sit right behind it, the grasses that go behind those big chunks. Work background to foreground. Again, there are very few absolutes in painting, but I have found that is the thing that works best for me, is to work background to foreground. Any tutorial you see with painting is only one way to paint. There's lots of different ways to paint, and admittedly, I am not an acrylic painter. I am an art teacher, and this is meant as a beginner tutorial for something like a landscape painting. This is just one approach. Okay, so I'm finally ready to go in with that yellow-orange. What I use for that was equal amounts of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, and a little bit of cadmium red. So again, equal amounts of those two yellows, a little bit of the red. And I was pretty satisfied with that. It wasn't exactly the color that I could see in the picture, but I wasn't really going for exactness in color. Instead, I wanted to capture more of the value change that was happening at the edges and make it look like the sun was shining through, and I think I captured that. Be careful when you're working with cadmiums especially. You don't want to absorb any kind of paint into your hands, into your body, but cadmiums can be particularly hazardous long term. You're not going to keel over if you touch cadmium yellow. Just wash your hands really well. There's actually this stuff that you can buy that you rub into your hands. I can't remember what it's called, but it's supposed to protect your skin and keep your skin from absorbing pigments if you touch them. But try not to touch them. You can always wear gloves. You can just be careful. They're not terribly, terribly toxic, but they're not good for you. You don't want to absorb paints through your skin, like I said, especially the cadmiums, cad yellow and cad red. So be careful. I think it's around this point that I decided I was using too much of the yellow orange, and I had to start to go in with some brown as well to balance that out. The first layer of brown had dried, of course, so I needed a different brush. I think I used the number 4 filbert for the brown, and the number, no, it was number 4, 4 for the orange, 6 for the brown, and I went back and forth between those two brushes so that I didn't have to interrupt my workflow, clean one brush, pick up the other color, and that's self-defeating in that case anyway, because in acrylic paint, it dries so fast that you really do have to keep on working if you want to blend stuff together. And I was finding that going back and forth between those two brushes, which I think I'm about to start any second now, going back and forth, I was able to blend the edges together. And I don't know if you can see this in the photo, but it's actually a very soft transition between the dark middle of the clumps coming out to the ends of the grass where they're really glowing because they're catching the sun. And I wanted to capture that transition. So applying wet brown at the same time as the yellow orange was the way that I figured to do that. And I think it worked pretty well. And I can't stress this enough, when you start to do something like a landscape especially, you really do have to train yourself to wait for the details. My students all the time, I teach high school classes mostly, and my students always want to jump right in and do the fun stuff. And if any of you are listening, which you're probably not, don't do that. Don't jump right to the good stuff. Don't jump right to those details, because you're going to regret it. You're going to look at the background and go, oh, what do I do now? Got to work background to foreground. It's really so much easier, especially with something like these really spare, thin marks that are going up into the blue. If I hadn't done the water first, there's no way you could do the water working around the grasses. So be smart about it. Gotta be patient. One of the reasons I chose this image was I really liked the way that the orange and blue contrasted together. It's one of my favorite kinds of contrast. I don't like green and red, but I love orange and blue. Depending on the tones, of course. Yellow and purple's not bad either. Okay, going in there to fix up some shadows. I tried to do most of the shadows first. I missed some. You're always going to have to adjust a little bit as you go along. But you want to have big groupings, like something big like that, how that shadow sort of wraps around the base of all those clumps of grasses. You want to have that done before you go in to do the details of the grass. If it's a similar situation like this, you run into that all the time with things like a landscape painting. Again, depending on your approach, maybe you're using big chunks of color and value and you're not paying attention to detail. Style varies so much. There's so many different styles out there, and you're going to develop your own. Again, if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you're a beginner landscape painter, because again, these are not intended for advanced painters. I am much more comfortable teaching oils, actually. This series of 3, actually 4, the series of 4 videos was intended, again, as an aid to my students during the COVID-19 quarantine. I don't know how many of them have watched it, and they didn't really have to, so that's okay. It was just meant to be there as an aid to them if they needed it. But I am planning on posting a series of oil paints, oil paintings, again, because I'm more comfortable with that. And if you're a beginner artist and you're looking for some tutorials on stuff, write it in the comments. Maybe I could get to that. I don't know. It's good to have stuff online anyway these days because we have no idea what we're going to be doing in the fall. If we're going to be teaching actual physical classes or if we're still online. Anyway, back to the painting. So I think I can see, yes, I have started with the red. So after I did the yellow-orange, I decided it was too yellow-orange and there's more variation in the actual picture. So I went back in, used the original color I had mixed up, added more of the cadmium red, and then went in with that red here and there, just for some variation. Then there were those little darts of really brightly colored grasses that were reflecting the sun really strongly, and I wanted to capture those too, and I think I overdid it in that area right there, but that's okay. Again, variation is key. I found with those, mostly it was grasses that were sticking out to the side that were catching the light that way. So I tried to be consistent with that. And almost done now. After the video will end, because, you know, time's in a warp. Anyway, after this ends, I'm going to flash the picture of the finished product. There's a couple things that I went back and did. A little bit of greenery in that foreground right-hand side. There were some little weed kind of things sticking up from behind the grasses. I put those in too. This is mostly finished. And here it comes. I'm kind of happy with it. Again, I'm not an acrylic landscape painter per se. That's not what I do for a living. I'm an art teacher for a living. So, thank you so much for watching and listening. Bye-bye.